You just watched someone count out their last $20, then hand half of it to a waiter. Not a birthday, not a special occasion, just a Tuesday. You wanted to ask why, but the real answer is far stranger than generosity. Hi, I'm Dave. I make videos about the hidden psychology behind the money decisions you make every single day. The stuff nobody explains to you but changes everything once you see it. Today, it's about tipping and why the people who can least afford to be generous are often the most generous people in the room. Here's the thing that breaks most people's assumptions. Studies on tipping behavior have found that people with less money often tip a higher percentage than people with more, not despite being broke, because of it. Does that sound backwards? It should. It goes against basically everything you'd expect from someone managing every dollar. Let's slow down and actually look at this. Picture two people at the same diner. One drives a car worth more than most people's yearly salary. The other took 2 buses to get there. Both order the same meal, both get the same service. And more often than research suggests, it's the second person who leaves the bigger percentage tip, not the first. Let's rewind further and understand why. Economist Michael Lin at Cornell University has spent decades studying tipping behavior specifically. He found that tip size isn't really about the quality of service at all. It's about identity. People tip to say something about who they are, especially when they don't have much else in that moment to say it with. Think about it. If you're wealthy, your car already says it. Your house already says it. The watch on your wrist already says it. You walk into a room and the message is sent before you even open your mouth. You don't need a tip to prove anything because everything around you is already proving it for you. But if you're struggling, the tip might be the only stage you get, the only moment someone else is actually watching you and forming a judgment about who you are. And in that tiny window, some people choose to be seen as generous, not because they were taught to, but because it's one of the last places they still have control. This connects to something psychologists call scarcity mindset. Princeton researcher Eldar Shafir has spent years studying this exact pattern alongside economist Sendhil Mullainathan. Together, they found that when resources are tight, the brain doesn't just spend less carefully, it reprioritizes everything. It starts protecting whatever feels threatened. And for a lot of people, what feels threatened isn't just their bank account, it's their sense of dignity. So the tip becomes something closer to armor. A 20% tip when you can barely afford groceries that week isn't irrational. It's not a math mistake. It's a message sent to a stranger who will forget it in 5 minutes, but felt deeply by the person sending it. It says, I am not what my bank account says I am. I am still generous. I am still someone who matters at this table, even if the world outside this diner doesn't always treat me that way. There's an older thread running underneath all of this, one that has nothing to do with modern money at all. Anthropologist Marcel Mauss wrote about gift-giving back in 1925, long before tipping apps, receipt screens, or suggested percentage buttons existed. He studied tribes and cultures across the world and found something remarkable. Giving has never really been about the item changing hands. It's about the invisible bond that gift creates between two people. A gift ties people together, even for a moment, even between a tired waiter working a double shift and a stranger who genuinely can't afford the extra $5 they just handed over. For a few seconds, that transaction becomes something bigger than money. It becomes proof that two people, strangers, briefly recognized each other as human beings worth something. Now flip the entire situation around. Why do wealthier people sometimes tip less percentage-wise, even when they can clearly afford more? It's easy to jump to an answer like greed or carelessness, but that's usually not what's happening. It's simpler and less dramatic than that. Wealthier people don't need the transaction to mean anything emotionally. Their identity is already secure somewhere else, built through career, property, status, decades of accumulated proof. The tip to them is just math, a percentage, a line item. It carries no emotional weight because their sense of self was never depending on it in the first place. For someone scraping by, the tip is a mirror. It reflects something back at them in a moment when very little else in their life is offering that reflection. And that difference, invisible on a receipt, is actually one of the most human things happening in that entire interaction. There's a related pattern that researchers have found in giving behavior more broadly. A well-known study published in the Proceedings of the National Sciences Academy, led by psychologist Paul Piff at UC Berkeley, looked at generosity across income levels using both real-world observation and controlled lab games. Piff and his team found that participants of lower socioeconomic status consistently gave a larger share of their resources to strangers than wealthier participants did, even when everyone started with the exact same small amount of money in the experiment. Piff's explanation echoes what we've already uncovered. Lower-income individuals, on average, tend to place higher value on community, connection, and mutual support simply because those things have historically mattered more to their day-to-day survival. Wealth, on the other hand, tends to correlate with a stronger sense of self-sufficiency, not because wealthy people are colder people, but because money itself teaches a lesson over time. It teaches you that you can solve most problems without leaning on anyone else. And when you don't need to lean on others, you sometimes forget how much it matters to be leaned on in return. This isn't a moral judgment on wealthy people, and it shouldn't be treated as one. It's simply a pattern shaped by circumstance. Give almost anyone enough financial cushion, and their brain quietly recalibrates. The tip stops being a statement and starts being a formality. Here's the twist that makes this even stranger once you sit with it. Behavioral economist Dan Ariely has shown again and again across dozens of experiments that people are far more driven by how they want to see themselves than by pure financial logic. We like to believe we make money decisions with our heads, calculated, rational, careful. Most of the time, we're actually making them with our self-image. And self-image doesn't check your bank balance before it makes a decision. It doesn't pause and ask if you can afford to be generous. It just decides who you're going to be in that moment, and your wallet has to catch up afterward. This shows up far beyond restaurants, too. Ariely's research has found similar patterns in charitable giving, in gift giving between friends, even in how people leave reviews or ratings. The poorer participant in an experiment will often give more, tip more, or donate more relative to what they actually have because the act itself is doing something deeper than exchanging money. It's confirming a story they're telling themselves about who they are. And it's worth pointing out this pattern isn't unique to modern America either. Similar tipping and gifting behavior has been observed in service industries across very different countries and cultures, wherever tipping norms exist at all. The specific percentages shift from place to place. The underlying psychology, the need to be seen as more than your circumstances, tends to hold steady no matter where you are. Think back to a moment in your own life, if you can. A time you gave more than you could really afford to someone who barely noticed. Maybe it was money. Maybe it was your time or your energy, or a favor that cost you more than you let on. Most of us have a memory like that somewhere. And most of us, if we're honest, weren't doing it purely out of kindness. We were doing it to remind ourselves who we still were, even when circumstances said otherwise. So the next time you see someone tipping big on a small paycheck, you're not watching bad math. You're not watching someone who doesn't understand their own finances. You're watching a person hold on to something money can never fully touch. Their sense of self, in a moment when almost everything else around them feels unstable, uncertain, or out of their control. It's easy to look at that behavior from the outside and call it irresponsible. Easy to say they should be saving that money instead, budgeting it, putting it toward rent or groceries or the next bill that's coming due. And on paper, sure, that's probably true. But humans were never purely on-paper creatures. We are emotional first and rational second most of the time, whether we like admitting that or not. The tip isn't a failure of financial planning. It's a small act of self-preservation dressed up as generosity. It's someone quietly telling the world, and more importantly telling themselves, that a thin wallet doesn't get to define the whole story. And there's something almost beautiful and a little heartbreaking about that. The people with the least to spare are often the ones proving over and over that generosity was never really about how much you have. It was always about who you decide to be with what little you've got. Maybe that's the real question underneath all of this. If your bank account disappeared tomorrow, completely, down to zero, what would you still spend money on to prove you're still you? What's the one thing you wouldn't cut, even if everything else had to go?
Some people would still buy their kid's favorite snack. Some people would still leave a tip they can't afford. Some people would still show up to a friend's birthday with a small gift, even if it meant skipping something they needed that week. None of that is irrational. It's identity, refusing to disappear just because the numbers got smaller. You watched someone hand over money they didn't really have. It wasn't about the waiter at all. It was about them. It was about proving, quietly, to no one but themselves, that who they are was never something a bank account could take away.